Hello, Dom. Good evening. My name is Miguel and I am 60 years old. I live in a small village in Argentina, a quiet place where everyone knows each other. My house is at the end of a dead-end street, surrounded by trees and with a garden that my wife Maria and I have cared for over the years. We raised our 2 daughters, Jessica and Karine, in this home, and we always felt safe and at peace. But everything changed when a new neighbor appeared on the other side. It was an autumn afternoon when I saw the moving truck parked in front of the house next door, which had been empty for months. At first, I didn't pay much attention after all. It's normal for someone to move in. However, when I saw the man step out of the truck, I felt a strange chill. He looked to be around 40, thin, with a cold and fixed gaze. He greeted me with a slight nod, but something in his eyes made me immediately suspicious. The first few weeks passed quietly. We hardly saw the new neighbor, whose name was Sebastian. He seemed to be very reserved, always with the curtains closed and rarely leaving the house. However, one day I noticed something strange. I was in the garden watering the plants when I saw Sebastian peeking through the curtain, staring at my house. I didn't think much of it, assuming it could just be a coincidence. Days passed and other strange things began to happen. One night during dinner, Karine mentioned that she had seen Sebastian in our backyard. I got up from the table immediately to check, but found no one. Even so, I remained on alert. And then I saw the note and knew something was wrong. The note read, "I watch you every day. You're beautiful." The handwriting was awkward, and there was a drawing of an eye. I felt a mix of fear and anger. I decided to confront Sebastian. I walked to his house and knocked firmly on the door. He appeared after a few seconds, with an uncomfortable smile on his face. "What do you want?" he asked coldly. "Were you in my garden? Did you leave this note on my daughter's window?" I asked, holding the note. Sebastian shook his head, and suddenly the smile disappeared. "I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't meddle in my neighbors' lives," he replied, shutting the door in my face. I returned home more unsettled than before. I decided to install security cameras around the house to ensure no one would threaten my family. The following weeks were filled with tension. One night, while reviewing the camera footage, I saw Sebastian lurking around our house, peeking through the windows and taking photos with his phone. My heart raced. I went to the police station immediately and filed a complaint. The police came to our house, reviewed the footage, and spoke to Sebastian. However, without sufficient evidence, all they did was give him a warning. Frustration consumed me, but fear overwhelmed me when, one night, I heard a scream coming from Jessica's room. I ran to her room and found the window open. Jessica was crying in bed. She said she saw Sebastian trying to get in through the window. I called the police immediately. This time, the situation was too serious to ignore. The police arrived quickly, went to Sebastian's house, and arrested him. When they began searching his house, they found something even more disturbing than I could have imagined. In a dark room, there were photos of my family, especially my daughters, plastered all over the walls. They were pictures taken from our garden, our windows, and some even seemed to have been taken from inside our house. They also found diaries where Sebastian described his obsessions and his plans to get closer to our daughters. The police informed us that Sebastian had a history of stalking in another city, but managed to evade prison by constantly moving from place to place. Finally, with all the gathered evidence, he was convicted and sentenced to several years in prison. The news spread quickly through the village, and the sense of security, which had vanished, slowly began to return. My family and I tried to resume our lives, but the emotional scars took time to heal. Jessica and Karine took a long time to feel safe again, and Maria and I took extra precautions to ensure our home was a protected environment. I often find myself thinking, if we could have done something differently, maybe prevented the suffering we went through. However, what I learned from this experience is that we must always trust our instincts and never ignore signs of danger. I feel relieved that my daughters are safe, and I hope our story serves as a warning to others. The safety and well-being of those we love are the most valuable things we have, and we must do everything in our power to protect them. I hope this account has been a reminder of the importance of always being vigilant and protecting our families. Safety is not something we can take for granted, and sometimes the threats are closer than we imagine. If you ever feel in danger or notice something unusual, don't hesitate to seek help and act to ensure the safety of yourself and those you love. Before we move on to the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to receive upcoming stories. Your presence is important, and your support is essential. Well, let's continue. Good evening, everyone. My name is Patricia, and I would like to share an experience I went through. I used to live in a ground-floor apartment, part of a 15-story building. It was one of the most affordable places in the area, which is why I rented it. Although the other apartments had balconies, mine, being on the ground floor, didn't. However, 2 large windows facing southwest allowed the sun to come in at the end of the day. Nevertheless, since the building didn't have air conditioning, the afternoon heat was intense, especially in the summer. I had been living there for a year when what I'm about to tell you happened. I didn't know many of my neighbors, as the place wasn't very welcoming. At the time, I worked in the city, and my commute took about an hour, which meant I spent only a few hours at home before going to sleep. There was a neighbor who lived at the end of the hallway. I knew this because I saw him coming and going, but I never learned much about him. He seemed older than me. I was 24, and he was probably around 50. He was short, stocky, and appeared strong. My apartment was small, a studio. There were no divisions between rooms except for a narrow hallway leading to the front door, lined with cabinets, and the bathroom, which had a door. The bed was near one of the windows, and the kitchen was in the opposite corner. That Friday night, I arrived home late. I'd gone out with a friend after work, and it was already past 10 p.m. When I entered the hallway, I saw my neighbor standing at the other end, watching me. I hurried to open the door and get inside. I didn't feel afraid at that moment. I just wanted to be alone. There was nothing to suggest that he was dangerous, so I didn't worry. About 10 minutes later, I brushed my teeth and was getting ready for bed when I heard the doorknob turning. I froze and stopped what I was doing. I looked through the peephole but didn't see anything. I cautiously opened the door and saw my neighbor walking away towards his apartment. When I stuck my head out, he turned around and looked directly at me. I quickly retreated, but he had already seen me. I was scared, but after sleeping on it, I rationalized. Maybe he had confused the apartments. After all, we were on the same floor and it was a Friday night. Many people drink on such occasions. At the time, all these excuses seemed to make sense. But that wasn't the last time. About a month later, on a hot night, I opened both windows as much as possible to try and cool the apartment down. Even after sunset, the apartment remained stifling. The ceiling fan spun at maximum speed, and the noise from the street combined with the fan's sound created a loud hum, but it was better than spending the night sweating. I went to bed around 11 p.m. as usual, and despite the noise, I eventually fell asleep. I woke up several times that night, once because of a siren. But on another occasion, I opened my eyes and saw someone standing at the foot of my bed. I cursed out loud and quickly grabbed my phone. The light switch was on the other side of the room, so I used the phone's flashlight. It was my neighbor from the hallway. As soon as I turned on the phone's light, he lunged at me. We struggled on the floor for a few seconds, and he seemed to be getting the upper hand. Desperately, I groped around for something to defend myself with, and finally grabbed a 2-kilo dumbbell I kept under the bed. I hit him on the head, and he collapsed, unconscious. Despite this, I managed to free myself from him and ran out of the apartment barefoot and in pajamas until I was able to call the police. When the police arrived, my neighbor had already disappeared. I told them what happened and explained where he lived. They knocked on his door, but no one answered. To this day, I don't know if he was inside or if he had fled somewhere else. Since there was no evidence besides my account, they couldn't force him to open the door if he was there. The next day, I informed the building management about what had happened. They reviewed the security cameras in the lobby, which should have captured the movement in the hallway, but the footage only showed me running out. There was no record of my neighbor. I knew this had happened because he left through the window, which was open just as he had entered. Due to the lack of evidence, he ended up going unpunished, and I found myself living next to someone who had basically tried to kill me. Needless to say, I moved out as soon as I had the chance. I can't imagine what could have happened if I had stayed there. I just hope he never finds another victim. If you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to leave your like. It's very important. Well, let's continue. Hi Dom, my name is Anna, and what I'm about to tell you happened in the early 80s when my family moved into a 3-story house. I had 2 daughters, and one of them was only 2 years old at the time. Shortly after meeting the neighbors upstairs, I discovered that their daughter was the same age as mine, and the two quickly became best friends. They also had twins. The husband had fought in Vietnam, and like many veterans, he struggled with what we now call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. He had a good job and seemed happy with his kids, but he dreamed of having a daughter. When they finally had a girl, she was born with severe birth defects, which were later attributed to the use of Agent Orange during the war. This genetic problem only affected girls. The twins were born healthy, but no one could have known this would happen until years after the conflict. The husband began blaming himself and drinking heavily. His anger toward the world would surface when he was intoxicated. One night, there was a knock on my door. It was his wife, asking if she could stay with my family until her husband fell asleep because he was drunk. Sometime later, he came down, furious, banging on my door, asking where his wife was. We tried to calm him down, saying that she would return as soon as he calmed down, explaining that she was afraid. He seemed to listen as he went back to the apartment. However, less than an hour later, he broke down our door, holding a shotgun. He demanded that his wife go back with him. I was standing between them, and he was pointing the gun at my head. All I could say was that I was ready to die because I'm a Christian and knew that my husband had already called the police from the bedroom. When he realized the threat wasn't going to work, he backed off but shouted that he was going to shoot the children. The police arrived soon after, and a standoff lasted for hours. My family and the neighbor managed to escape through the back window and went to the house of some friends down the street. In the end, he released the children but continued threatening everyone's lives. I don't know what they said to calm him down, but they eventually took him to the hospital for treatment. I'm not sure if this is an appropriate story to share, but it was a terrifying experience at the time. Well, let's move on to the next story. This happened when I was around 12 years old. I lived with my mother and 2 siblings in a quiet suburb. Our house was simple, 2 stories, with a spacious backyard. It was near the primary school, and many of our neighbors were kids who also studied there. It was the late 80s, and almost every day we went out to play in the street. We rode bikes, played hockey, and hide and seek. When the sun started to set, our parents would call our names from the door, and it was time to go back inside. Andre was my neighbor and lived next door, a year older than me. There was a fence between our houses, and occasionally we'd hang out, but we were never very close. That summer, though, we started spending more time together, probably because of how close we lived. Soon, his friend Bruno started showing up too. He was from another neighborhood, but I already knew him from school. Whenever he came over, his mom would drop him off, or he would show up on his bike. The 3 of us would wander around the neighborhood looking for things to do, and sometimes we went to nearby parks or trails in the woods. One day, Andre suggested we explore an area about 20 minutes from my house. Bruno brought his backpack, though I didn't know why. After some time in the woods, we veered off the trail because Andre mentioned knowing a place we could go. It was an old fort, probably built by other kids years before. I thought it would be a fun place to hang out. When we got there, Bruno walked a few meters away. I thought he was going to relieve himself, but when he came back, he had a mischievous grin on his face. To my surprise, he was holding a gun. Andre laughed nervously and a chill ran down my spine. I'd never seen a real gun before, only on TV or in movies, and it felt surreal and terrifying. Bruno started waving the gun around carelessly. Andre and I exchanged looks, clearly scared but unsure what to do. At that moment, I realized how quickly things had spiraled out of control. I never liked Bruno much. He always made me uncomfortable. He was unpredictable, and I constantly felt like he might hit me at any moment. His presence made me anxious. Bruno continued messing around with the gun for a while. Neither Andre nor I had the courage to try and stop him. Suddenly, the gun went off accidentally. Luckily, it was pointed at the ground, but the sound was so loud it nearly burst my eardrums. All I could hear afterward was a ringing that lasted for about 2 minutes. Birds flew out of the trees, and Bruno immediately dropped the gun. We were lucky the bullet buried itself in the ground and no one got hurt. When I regained my senses, I saw Bruno clutching his hand and bent over. For a moment I thought he was injured, but I soon realized he had hurt his hand when the gun fired. It must have been the recoil that caused the injury, and he ended up breaking his hand because of it. As we headed back home, the air was heavy. My ears were still ringing, and it was clear Bruno was holding back tears. I didn't say anything because I was afraid he'd get angry if I said the wrong thing. When we got close to where Andre and I lived, Bruno turned to me serious. "You're not going to tell anyone about this, right?" he asked. I was surprised by the question. I hadn't even considered telling anyone. "No, I won't say anything," I replied. Andre nodded in agreement and we parted ways. From that day on, something changed between Andre and me. Later, I found out that Bruno's dad discovered he had stolen the gun. I still don't know how that happened, but there are a few possibilities. Maybe he noticed the gun had been fired or realized it was missing that afternoon. Perhaps someone even heard the shot. Either way, Bruno was convinced that I had betrayed him. He started spreading rumors at school that he was going to fight me and began gossiping. Naturally, Andre sided with him. After all, they were best friends. Every time Bruno showed up to meet Andre, I felt afraid. I knew I couldn't win in a fight and that he was unstable, so I tried my best to avoid him. One time, while I was lying in bed, I heard voices in my backyard. I got up and went to the window, and there were Bruno and Andre standing in the dark. When I opened the curtains, they saw me and ran off. One afternoon, on my way home from school, Andre and Bruno cornered me on the street. Without warning, Andre pushed me against the wall and grabbed my shoulders tightly. Bruno beside him moved in and started punching me while Andre held me down. I didn't try to defend myself. I was terrified of making the situation worse. For a long time after that, I was constantly worried, scared that something even worse might happen. I was certain the two of them were conspiring against me because people at school were saying they talked about it. As the weeks passed, the bullying started to fade. Maybe a teacher noticed what was happening and intervened. I didn't know the reason, but I was relieved that it was over. What happened that summer left a deep mark on me. Years later, when I was in college, my mum moved to a new place. Not too far, but far enough that we no longer lived next to Andre's family. During winter break, I went to a party, and to my surprise, I saw Andre leaning against the wall holding a beer. He didn't look too different from how he did back in primary school. At first, I didn't know if I should ignore him or say hello. When he noticed me, he nodded. I walked over and said, "Hello." We talked for a bit, but we both carefully avoided mentioning the events of that summer. The conversation flowed surprisingly well, and for a few moments, it was like I was talking to the kid I used to hang out with before everything went wrong. However, the elephant in the room was there, and neither of us brought up what happened. After a few minutes, we said goodbye, and I never saw him again. If I had to guess, I'd say Andre felt guilty for what he did to me. He probably knew I never told anyone, but still, he went along with Bruno's game. I didn't bother bringing up the past because I had moved on. However, I still wonder what happened to Bruno. I'd be surprised if he's doing well. I used to live with two great friends, Diego and Juliano. We shared a small house with 3 bedrooms. Our friendship went back to our school days, and I had even lived with Juliano for a while during college. At the time this story happened, we were 25 years old. I was working part-time, Diego was pursuing his personal projects, and Juliano was still a university student, also doing some Uber driving on the side. The neighborhood we lived in wasn't the most welcoming. Most people rented houses just like us. Many homes were converted into boarding houses, you know, the ones with rows of mailboxes. It was a common sight on our street, unlike our house, which was still a normal home, a bit of a rarity there. One of our neighbors, a few houses down, seemed like a different reality. We joked that it was a drug house. At first it was just a joke, but over time it became more serious. I met them a few times, but it was pretty clear to me that they were involved with drugs. I'm not a stranger to this kind of situation, so I recognized the signs. But by that time, I had been away from that scene for over 3 years. Several strange things happened because of those neighbors. One night I woke up in the middle of the night and went to the bathroom. I took the opportunity to grab a glass of water in the kitchen, and when I looked out the window, I saw 3 cars stopped in the middle of the street, not even bothering to park. It was 3 a.m. I went to the living room window to get a better view and saw 2 people standing suspiciously in front of the neighbor's house. I went back to my room and continued watching from the window. Those cars stayed there for about 10 minutes before leaving. I had no idea what they were doing, but it seemed really odd. The next day I mentioned what I had seen to Diego and Juliano. They had also witnessed strange things there. We knew something was going on, but we decided to ignore it. Another night I was woken up by a desperate scream coming from outside. I rolled over in bed and went to the window that faced the front of our house. Peeking behind the curtains, I didn't see anything but the empty street. There was a street light nearby, which would have given me a good view if anyone had been there, but there wasn't. The scream stopped as suddenly as it had started, and I went back to sleep. The next morning we discussed calling the police, but without more details we chose not to. I thought about moving, but what I earned at the time wouldn't allow me to afford anything better. Even so, I didn't think we were in any real danger, as everyone pretty much kept to themselves. That's why we stayed. Life went on for a while until one Friday night when we were all playing video games in the living room. We had an extra friend with us, so there were 4 of us in total. The living room was at the front of the house, our favorite spot to play. The window facing the street was always closed with the curtains drawn. If we opened them, we could see the corner of the porch. It was past 10 p.m. when we heard footsteps on the porch. We had invited another friend to join us, but he had said he probably wouldn't come. At first, we thought it was him, so I went to take a look through the window. When I looked, I saw a man standing on our porch. He was wrapped in something that looked like a sheet. In fact, it seemed to be all he was wearing. Upon closer inspection, I noticed he was wearing only one shoe. So it definitely wasn't just a sheet. The man stood there staring at our door as if waiting for someone to open it. The strange thing was that he didn't even ring the bell or knock. He stood still for over an hour, barely moving. It was only when our friend wanted to leave but couldn't get to his bike that we decided to call the police. No one wanted to walk past that man. As soon as the police arrived, the man wrapped in the sheet simply walked away, heading toward the neighbor's house. The officers went over there but only gave a warning. A few days later, when I got home late, I saw 2 police cars parked in front of the neighbor's house. I was coming from a different direction, so I never passed directly by and I couldn't see much. When I got inside, I thought they had finally arrested the residents for something. That must have been the case because after that day, we never saw anyone there again. About 2 weeks passed, and we were sure they had moved out. A month later, someone new had already taken the place. I'm not sure what caused the trouble, but my guess is that it had to do with drugs. The house attracted all kinds of people, and the strange events were a clear sign of that. What still bothers me is the scream that woke me up once. Something so terrifying could have been a sign of something awful. Or maybe it was just a disturbed person. We'll never know. Either way, my friends and I continued living in the house for another 3 or 4 years, and the neighborhood became much quieter without those neighbors. If you've made it this far and are enjoying the stories, let me know in the comments. Your feedback is very important for my work. Well, let's continue. Good evening, Dom. My name is Mariana. I'm 23 years old, and I recently moved into a small apartment in a big city after spending my entire life living with my parents in a small town. I felt it was the right time to gain my independence and seek new opportunities. I got a job as an administrative assistant at a digital marketing company, which allowed me to save enough to finally rent my own place. The move was exciting. The idea of living alone in the city filled me with enthusiasm and expectation. My new home was an apartment in a 10-story building located in the city center. It wasn't very big, but it was perfect for just one person. It had a cozy living room, a compact kitchen, a bathroom, and a bedroom. From the window, I could observe the hustle and bustle of the city with its constant movement and typical noise. The building was well maintained, and most of the neighbors seemed quiet, focused on their own routines. In the first few days, everything went as I expected. My routine was simple: wake up early, go to work, come back home, and in my free time explore the city. Weekends were a mix of rest and meeting up with the friends I made at work. Things were going well until I started to notice something unusual. It was a Friday night and I had just gotten home after a long week of work. I decided to relax on the couch, watch a movie, and have a glass of wine. Suddenly, I heard a light knock at the door. When I opened it, I saw one of my neighbors, a man in his 40s, thin and with a somewhat disheveled appearance. His name was Roberto. I had never really noticed him up close, though I had seen him in the hallway a few times. "Hi, I'm Roberto. I live in the apartment at the end of the hallway," he said, flashing a smile that seemed a bit forced to me. "I just wanted to welcome you to the building. If you need anything, feel free to reach out." I thanked him for his kindness, but there was something about the way he looked at me that made me a little uncomfortable. Even so, I didn't think much of it at the time and went back to my movie, closing the door. In the following weeks, I started to notice some strange things happening. Several times when I came home, I found the door slightly open, even though I was sure I had locked it properly when I left. At first, I thought there might be an issue with the lock, so I asked the building manager to take a look. He checked it and assured me everything was working fine. One Sunday, while I was cleaning the apartment, I noticed some of my belongings were out of place. Small things like my hairbrush, the book I was reading, and even my spare set of keys seemed to have been moved. The situation began to worry me more. I spoke with the manager again, who insisted that no one but me had access to the apartment. The situation became even more serious one night when I came home from work and found a note under the door. It read, "I'm always watching you." A cold fear washed over me. I immediately remembered Roberto's strange smile and began to suspect that he might be involved. I decided to install a security camera in the living room, positioned to record the apartment entrance. I needed evidence. For a few days I reviewed the footage, but nothing unusual showed up. Then one night I saw something that terrified me. Roberto entering my apartment using a key. He calmly walked around the living room, looked at some of my things, and then left, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Fear turned to anger. Knowing I couldn't handle this alone, I called my friend Fernanda and asked her to come over and keep me company. We went to speak with the building manager, who was shocked when he saw the footage. He accompanied us to Roberto's apartment. When he opened the door and saw us, his face was a mix of surprise and irritation. "What do you want?" he asked, trying to remain calm. "We know you've been entering my apartment," I said, showing him the video. "This is unacceptable and I'm going to report you to the police." Roberto denied everything at first, but when he realized he was cornered, he began shouting and threatening us. The building manager immediately called the police, who arrived quickly and took Roberto in for questioning. During the investigation, they discovered that he had keys to several other apartments. It seemed Roberto had broken into more than one apartment in the building. Still, he was released soon after, as there wasn't enough evidence of more serious wrongdoing. They didn't find any signs of theft or that he had caused physical harm to anyone. Curiously, that same week, Roberto disappeared. No one in the building saw him again. Some thought he had moved, while others believed he was just hiding. I, honestly, felt relieved, but the fear still lingered. Even with Roberto gone, the situation left its mark. I changed the locks on my apartment, installed more security cameras, and became much more careful about never going home alone. I continued living in that apartment for another 2 years before deciding to move. I never found out what happened to Roberto, and although it was reassuring to think he had disappeared for good, part of me always wondered if he might reappear one day. This experience taught me a lot about always being vigilant and trusting my instincts. The city is undoubtedly full of opportunities and excitement, but it also hides dangers we don't expect. Living alone gave me the freedom I was looking for, but it also made me realize how important it is to always be ready to protect myself.